You ever feel like you were born into the wrong family? Like maybe somewhere in the cosmic lottery, your ticket got mixed up and now you're stuck playing a role in a story that was never meant to be yours. Yeah, that's been my life. Growing up in a small coastal town, you'd think my sister and I had it pretty good. Our parents ran a well-known seafood restaurant, and from the outside, we looked like one of those wholesome, hard-working families where everyone pitched in and Sunday dinners were sacred. But reality? Reality was that Sophia, my older sister, was the queen of the castle, and I was just some extra they forgot to edit out of the story. It didn't start off obvious. When we were little, things seemed normal enough, but as we got older, the signs were everywhere. If Sophia aced a test, it was proof of her brilliance. If I did, it was just expected. If she broke a plate, it was an accident. If I so much as left my room messy, I got a lecture about responsibility. And don't even get me started on birthdays. One year, she got a brand new phone while I got, wait for it, a motivational book on the power of hard work. By the time we hit our teens, the favoritism wasn't just unspoken, it was practically a family tradition. Sophia could do no wrong, and even when she did, my parents bent over backward to explain it away. Skipping class? She's just going through a phase. Blowing through money? She just needs to find her passion. Meanwhile, if I so much as forgot to take out the trash, I was met with, how do you expect to survive in the real world? I tried not to let it get to me. I worked hard, got good grades, held down a part-time job at a roadside diner where the coffee tasted like regret and exhaustion. I did everything right. But doing everything right doesn't mean anything when your existence barely registers to the people who are supposed to love you the most. Then came the moment that really drove it home. Right before Sophia's college graduation, which, by the way, she was barely scraping by in, my parents dropped a bombshell. They had decided without asking me that she could live at home as long as she wanted. No rent, no responsibilities. She just needs time to figure things out, they said. Meanwhile, I was working myself to the bone trying to afford school because they had made it very clear they weren't paying for my tuition. And then, like some kind of cruel joke, on my 18th birthday, they sat me down at the kitchen table and told me it was time for me to be independent. Not in the vague, go chase your dreams kind of way. No, in the very literal, you have 2 weeks to pack your things and get out kind of way. At first, I thought it was a joke. It had to be, right? But the next day, I came home to find my things already packed. Just like that. Sophia was still there, of course, probably picking out the color of her next car, courtesy of our parents. Meanwhile, the first stood there, staring at my life reduced to a few cardboard boxes, realizing maybe for the first time that I had never actually been part of this family. I didn't even argue. What was the point? I loaded my stuff into my rusted old car, the one I'd bought with my own money, because unlike my sister, I wasn't gifted a brand new ride, and drove off without looking back. I had no plan, no safety net. Just a few $100 and the sinking feeling that for the first time in my life, I was truly alone. I always thought rock bottom would feel different, that there'd be some dramatic moment where I'd hit the floor, stare up at the universe, and have a realization about my place in the world. Instead, rock bottom felt like a lumpy mattress in a tiny rented room, the sound of my neighbor's TV blaring through the paper-thin walls, and the taste of stale gas station coffee at 3 a.m. With nowhere else to go, I found a cheap room in a run-down part of town, the kind of place where you triple-check that the front door locks and sleep with one ear open. My bank account was already gasping for air, so I did the only thing I could: work. I picked up extra shifts at the diner, cooking greasy burgers and pretending not to hear the late-night regulars arguing over who was more washed up. But even that wasn't enough, so I took a second job stocking shelves at a grocery store overnight. Between the two, I barely had time to sleep, let alone think about what had happened. Maybe that was the point. If I just kept moving, kept grinding, maybe I wouldn't have to deal with the fact that my own parents had cut me out like an unwanted scene in a movie. And Sophia? She was thriving. Her Instagram was a highlight reel of expensive brunches, shopping sprees, and weekend trips courtesy of our parents, of course. While I was rationing instant ramen and counting pennies for rent, she was busy finding herself on spa weekends. I wondered if she even noticed I was gone. Probably not. One night, after a particularly brutal shift at the diner, I was walking home in the rain. My hoodie was soaked, my shoes squished with every step, and I was running on maybe 4 hours of sleep in the past 2 days. As I passed a corner store, something caught my eye, a tiny, shivering dog curled up under the dim neon light. It was small, scrappy, with wet fur clumping together and ribs just barely visible beneath its coat. It looked like it had already given up. I hesitated. The last thing I needed was another responsibility. I could barely take care of myself. How was I supposed to take care of a dog? But when I crouched down, it lifted its head, big frightened eyes locking onto mine. Eyes that felt a little too familiar. I sighed. All right, buddy, let's go. I scooped him up and tucked him under my hoodie, hurrying home through the rain. My apartment wasn't much, just a tiny room with peeling wallpaper and a kitchen that was really just a counter with a microwave, but it was warm. I wrapped him in the cleanest towel I owned and rummaged through my cabinets for something remotely dog-friendly. Scrambled eggs and a slightly stale piece of bread would have to do. The little guy inhaled the food, then curled up against my leg with a heavy sigh, like he had finally found a safe place. I knew the feeling. At first, I told myself I wasn't keeping him, that I'd find a shelter or a new home for him soon. But the days passed, and I never did. He followed me around like a shadow, hopping onto my mattress at night, curling up against my chest like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. I started calling him Buddy. I told myself it was temporary, that this wasn't a commitment. But deep down, I think I already knew. For the first time in months, I wasn't completely alone. I wasn't looking for anyone. After months of juggling 2 exhausting jobs and living off gas station sandwiches, my world had shrunk to nothing but survival. Work, eat when I could, sleep barely, repeat. That was it. No room for friends, no time for anything beyond making sure I had enough to pay rent and keep Buddy fed. But life has a way of throwing people at you when you least expect it. It started with a Facebook post. I was mindlessly scrolling through Marketplace, searching for a cheap secondhand microwave since mine had decided to finally give up. That's when I saw a post in a local community group. Someone was looking for their lost dog. The picture was unmistakable. It was Buddy. My stomach twisted into knots. I told myself I wasn't attached, that I was just doing the right thing by giving him a home when he had none. But looking at that post, I knew I had been lying to myself. For nearly 2 months, Buddy had been the only thing keeping me grounded, the only constant in my life. And now, in one stupid post, I realized he was never mine to begin with. I almost ignored it. I really did. But deep down, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I called the number on the post. A soft, almost fragile voice answered. Hello? I cleared my throat. I think I might have found your dog. There was silence on the other end. Then, a sharp inhale, like the woman had been holding her breath for so long she forgot how to exhale. Are you sure? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked down at Buddy, curled up at my feet, his tail thumping lazily against the floor. Yeah, I'm sure. She asked if we could meet that afternoon. I said yes. I almost backed out a dozen times on the way there. Buddy sat in the passenger seat of my rusted old car, staring at me with those big brown eyes like he knew something was up. I tried not to look at him. The address led me to a tiny bungalow on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much small, with paint peeling from the wooden siding and a mailbox leaning so far to one side it was barely standing. The yard was overgrown, but there were little details that made it feel lived in. A wind chime hanging from the porch, a rocking chair with a faded floral cushion, a sense of quiet history. I barely had time to knock before the door swung open. The woman standing there was older, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a thick cardigan despite the warm afternoon air, her frail hands trembling slightly as she took in the sight of Buddy. For a second, she didn't move. Then, with a choked sob, she reached out, her hands flying to her mouth as she started crying. Buddy knew before I even said a word. He leaped from my arms and straight into hers, his tail wagging wildly as he licked her face. Whining with excitement, she sank to her knees on the porch, holding him like he was the most precious thing in the world. I thought he was gone forever, she whispered. Her name was George, and Buddy, whose real name, apparently, was Max, had been her only companion after her husband passed away. She had lost him during a storm months ago, and despite searching everywhere, she had given up hope of ever seeing him again. She invited me inside, and though I hadn't planned on staying long, something about the warmth of her home made it impossible to leave right away. The house smelled like cinnamon, and something vaguely nostalgic, like an old bakery mixed with warm tea. The furniture was worn but comfortable, the walls lined with framed photos. Most of them were old, their edges curling from time, the faces of smiling people long gone. George moved slowly, but with purpose, as she shuffled into the kitchen to make tea. "You don't have to," I started, but she waved me off. "Nonsense, Set." I sat. She brewed tea the way someone who had done it 1,000 times would, measured, patient, like each step was part of a ritual. When she finally settled into the chair across from me, she looked at me closely, her sharp eyes scanning my face. "You look tired," she said simply. I let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, it's been a long couple of months." George didn't ask for details. She didn't pry. She just nodded, stirring her tea. The world can be cruel to people who don't have anyone looking out for them. That hit a little too close to home. I stared into my cup, unsure what to say. For the first time in a long time, someone was just there, offering quiet kindness without expecting anything in return. And that felt strange. Before I left, she reached across the table and patted my hand. "Come back sometime," I told her I would, and for the first time in forever, I actually meant it. I didn't plan on going back. That first visit to George's house was supposed to be a one-time thing, a final goodbye to Buddy, or Max, as I was now supposed to call him. But a few days later, as I passed by his street on my way home from another grueling shift at the diner, something made me slow down. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. Either way, before I even realized what I was doing, I had pulled into the driveway. I knocked once, half expecting George to have already forgotten who I was. Instead, the door swung open almost immediately, and there he stood, looking at me like he'd been expecting me all along. "Took you long enough," he said, a knowing twinkle in his eye. That was how it started. At first, I'd stop by just to check in, making sure Buddy Max was settling back in. But soon, it wasn't about the dog anymore. George and I became something. Not quite friends, not quite family, but something. I started helping out around his house, fixing things he insisted weren't that bad, but had obviously been broken for years. A squeaky front door, a leaky kitchen faucet, the old TV remote that only worked when you smacked it twice against the coffee table. He never asked me to do any of it, but I could tell he appreciated it. In return, he made sure I never left his house hungry. Every time I stopped by, he'd insist on feeding me real food, not the sad instant ramen and gas station snacks I had been living on. "You work too damn much," he muttered one evening, handing me a plate of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes. "Yeah, well, rent won't pay itself," I said, taking a bite. He hummed, stirring his tea. "Still, young people work too hard these days. Always rushing, always exhausted, no time to just be." I didn't respond, mostly because, for the first time in months, I was actually eating something that wasn't borderline expired. Over time, George started telling me stories, small pieces of his life, things that had gone wrong, things that had once been good. He had a daughter once, Laura. They used to be close, but something had happened years ago, something about money, though I got the feeling it ran deeper than that. One day, the calls stopped coming. The visits too. And just like that, he was alone. He told me about the holidays that used to mean something, about the grandkids he hadn't seen in years, but he never said it with bitterness, just quiet acceptance. Like he had made peace with the fact that the people he once loved had left him behind. And maybe that was why I kept coming back, because I knew exactly what that kind of silence felt like. One day, after fixing the wobbly kitchen table, George handed me an envelope. "What's this?" I asked. $20, he said. I laughed, shaking my head. "I'm not running a handyman service, George." He gave me a stubborn look. "It's not for the work. It's for the company." I rolled my eyes but left the money on the counter when he wasn't looking. And just like that, visiting George became part of my routine. I was still working 2 jobs, still scraping by, but somehow, his house felt like the one place in the world where I could just exist without having to prove anything to anyone. Buddy Max still greeted me like I was his favorite person in the world, even though I knew George was his real home. The house still smelled like cinnamon and old books, and somehow, without me even realizing it, I had become part of something again. Then, 6 months in, everything changed. I stopped by after my grocery shift, expecting to find George in his usual spot by the window, reading one of his mystery novels. But the second I stepped onto the porch, something felt off. The front door was unlocked. A half-folded newspaper lay on the welcome mat, untouched. Inside, the house was too quiet, too still. "George?" the first called. No answer. Then I saw him, collapsed on the floor by the kitchen table, his tea mug shattered beside him. Buddy Max was sitting next to him, whining softly, nudging his hand like he was trying to wake him up. I didn't think. I just moved, dialed 911, checked for a pulse, felt the cold sweat break out on my back as I tried to remember every first aid step I had ever learned. The seconds stretched into hours. By the time the paramedics arrived, I was frozen in place, still kneeling beside him, still gripping his hand like I could somehow hold him here. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee. I hated places like this, too bright, too sterile, too full of people waiting for news they didn't want to hear. But I stayed. I wasn't family. I had no authority to make decisions. But when the nurses asked if there was anyone they should call, no one else came to mind. So I stayed. For 3 days, I sat by his hospital bed, watching his chest rise and fall under the thin hospital blanket. When he finally woke up, the first thing he did was sigh, like I was the most predictable thing in the world. Of course you're here. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Where else would I be? His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but he still managed to say, "You've got a good heart, kid." I shook my head. I just did what anyone would do. He gave me a look. "No, you didn't." A pause. Then, softer. "You remind me of my late wife. She always looked out for people, even when they didn't deserve it." I swallowed hard, not sure how to respond to that. Then, with what little strength he had left, he squeezed my hand and said, "Your family, whether you like it or not." I stayed until visiting hours were over, then promised I'd be back first thing in the morning. But George never made it through the night. The next morning, I sat in his empty hospital room, staring at the neatly folded blankets on the bed, trying to process the fact that he was gone. No one came to claim his things. No grieving family. No long-lost daughters showing up at the last minute. It was just me, and Buddy Max standing in the doorway, feeling like ghosts in someone else's story. The funeral was small. A few neighbors, an old friend from church. I made sure he had flowers. I made sure his name wasn't just another line in the obituary section of the paper. But still, it felt wrong. Like the world had moved on too quickly. Like George had never been here at all. Then, a week later, I got a call. A lawyer said he needed to see me about George. I almost told him he had the wrong person, but something in my gut told me to go. And that was when everything changed. I walked into the lawyer's office expecting nothing. Maybe some old family heirloom, a letter, something small, a parting gift from George to say thanks. What I didn't expect was to be sitting in a polished conference room, facing a man in a suit so crisp it probably cost more than my entire life savings. He slid a thick folder across the desk toward me. "Mr. Whitmore wanted you to have this." I hesitated before picking it up, flipping through the pages. At first, the words didn't make sense. Then, my brain short-circuited. The house, the bank account, a plot of land outside of town. $500,000. I blinked at the papers, gripping them so tightly my knuckles turned white. "There's gotta be a mistake." The lawyer shook his head. "No mistake. He left everything to you." I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Why? The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Because, in his words, SHE's, the only one who ever showed up when it mattered. I sat there, staring at the legal documents, my mind still refusing to believe it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't broke. I wasn't barely scraping by. I had spent so long struggling to survive that the idea of having something, of owning something, felt foreign, like I had stepped into someone else's life. I left the office in a daze, barely remembering how I got home, or, well, to my home, because that's what it was now. The house looked different as I stood in front of it. Less like George's, more like something I had to figure out how to live in. I spent the next few days adjusting, moving in my sad excuse for belongings, trying to wrap my head around the fact that I didn't have to stress about rent anymore. Buddy Max claimed his usual spot on the couch, like we were both trying to find our place in this strange new reality. I stocked the fridge with real food, bought an actual mattress instead of the lumpy Craigslist one I'd been using, upgraded from instant coffee to the fancy ground stuff. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. Then, the problem arrived. I should have known peace wouldn't last. It started with a text from Sophia. "Dude, what the hell? You bought a house?" I reread the message 3 times, the word bought making me snort. She must have heard from someone that I was living in a nice house now. Small towns loved to talk. Maybe a neighbor mentioned it. Maybe she had driven by and spotted me unlocking the door. And if she knew, that meant my parents did too. 2 hours later, my phone rang. My mother. I stared at the screen, already knowing exactly where this was going. I let it ring out. A minute later, a text popped up. We need to talk. Yeah, I bet we did. The next day, there was a knock at my door. Buddy Max started barking like he was auditioning for a home security commercial. I wasn't in the mood for my new neighbors to start side-eyeing me, so I opened the door, and there they were, my parents, standing on my porch like they had just casually dropped by for a cup of coffee. The last time I had seen them, they were boxing up my things and leaving them by the front door. Now, my mom had that tight, forced smile she used when she wanted something, and my dad stood there awkwardly, hands shoved in his pockets, like a guilty kid caught in the act. We were in the neighborhood, she said. I raised an eyebrow. They lived 20 minutes away. This wasn't exactly on the way to anywhere they usually went. I didn't invite them in, just leaned against the doorframe, waiting. It didn't take long for them to get to the point. My mom started talking about family values, about how things had been so difficult back then, about how they missed me. They never actually apologized. Instead, they acted like time had magically erased everything. Then came the real reason they were here. Sophia had burned through whatever money they had been giving her. She had dropped out of college, couldn't hold down a job, and now, for the first time in her life, she was struggling. And, of course, my parents had been covering for her. They had stretched their finances thin, trying to keep her afloat. Now they were looking at me, the daughter they hadn't cared about for years, because suddenly I was the one with the resources. I almost laughed. Almost. I let them talk, watching how carefully they chose their words, how my mom's voice softened when she tried to bring up second chances, how my dad nodded along, like he agreed with every word she said. It was all an act. They didn't care about reconnecting with me. They cared about the house, about the money, and they thought I was still that desperate kid, starving for their approval. I let the silence stretch before I finally spoke. I think you should go. My mom blinked. Honey, No, I said, my voice calm. You left me behind when I had nothing. You don't get to come back now that I have something. She looked genuinely shocked. My dad sighed, shaking his head like I was the unreasonable one. Sophia would have thrown a tantrum, but she wasn't here. My guess? She was too embarrassed to show up herself, so she sent them instead. They tried one more time, but I didn't budge. Eventually they left, walking back to their car in silence. I stood there, watching them drive away, waiting for the usual wave of guilt to hit me, but it never came. Instead, for the first time in a long time, I felt something else entirely: free. The first check from the land lease hit my bank account a few weeks later. For a second, I thought it was a mistake. I had signed the agreement with a developer, but seeing the actual money roll in felt surreal. I wasn't just okay anymore. I was thriving. I upgraded my life in small ways, got a grill for the backyard, bought a decent set of cookware, started meal prepping like some kind of responsible adult. Meanwhile, my parents were drowning. I didn't go looking for updates, but small towns talked. Sophia had blown through everything. My parents had maxed out their credit trying to save her. Now, they were selling their house. The expensive car she used to flex with, gone. A part of me expected them to come back, to try one last guilt trip, but they didn't. Maybe they finally got the message, or maybe they were too ashamed. Either way, I wasn't losing sleep over it. One night, I sat on the porch, sipping a drink, watching Buddy Max chase fireflies in the yard. And it hit me. Family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up when it matters. And, for the first time in my life, I had finally won. Story 2. For the past few hours, I've been sitting here, running everything over in my head. Maybe I'm overthinking, but I needed to get this out somehow. And since I know this space has helped me sort through things before, here I am, hoping someone can help me make sense of it all. I'm 31, a real estate developer, married to an amazing woman, Lucy, and father to a 3-year-old son. Life is good. It wasn't always this way, though. When I was 17, my parents kicked me out, accusing me of stealing something I didn't take. I won't pretend I was an easy kid, stubborn, defiant, and always pushing back, but still, getting thrown out at that age felt like the ultimate betrayal. I had no safety net, no backup plan. For a while, I was homeless, just trying to stay alive. The system was an option, but I refused to be another statistic. I did whatever I could to survive odd jobs, couch surfing when I got lucky, even spending nights in parks when I wasn't. Eventually, I hit rock bottom. There were days I thought I wouldn't make it. Nights, I wondered if I even wanted to, but something inside me wouldn't let me quit. At 21, I landed a job as a server in a high-end restaurant. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. Around the same time, I got clean. I'd used substances to numb the pain before, but I knew they were only dragging me down. It was hard, but I kept going. Then I met Lucy. She was a customer, dining with her mother, and from the first conversation, something clicked. She was kind, genuinely interested in me, not in a pitying way, but like I actually mattered. Over time, she became my biggest supporter, the person who saw something in me that I hadn't even seen in myself. Because of her, I went back to school, finished my degree, and worked my way up in real estate development. At 25, when I finally felt like I was worthy of her, I asked her out. Turned out, she'd been waiting for me to. We got married, built a life together, and now we have a beautiful family. I never thought about reconnecting with my parents. My father had made it clear back then, don't come back. We're done. I took him at his word. Even as I became successful, I stayed away. Not because I hated them, but because I thought they wouldn't care. Then, a few weeks ago, my father sent me a friend request. When I saw his name, I froze. After more than a decade, why now? I hesitated, but eventually accepted. The first message he sent cracked something in me. He said he'd thought about me every day, that he regretted the past, that he was getting older and didn't want to leave this world without making things right. He claimed my whole family missed me and wanted me back in their lives. I didn't know what to believe, but we kept talking, and after weeks of messages, I agreed to meet. A few days ago, they came over, my father, my mother, and my younger sister, Sophie. She's 26 now, engaged, and from what I gathered, living a good life. The visit was surreal. My parents seemed happy to see me. My father especially was full of praise, shocked at how well I'd done for myself. My mother was more reserved, but she was civil. Sophie, though, she loved the house. She kept asking my wife about every little detail, practically gushing over it. At first, I was just relieved the meeting went well. Then, my father made a comment that threw me completely. We were in my study, just the two of us. He looked around and said, "Wow, this place is incredible. I never expected you to have something like this." I laughed it off, saying I was proud of what I'd built. I even told him it wouldn't have been possible without Lucy's support. Then he said, "It's great that you're doing well. Your sister's getting married soon, you know. She'd love a house like this." I nodded. Yeah, she really seemed to like it. And then he said the thing that's been haunting me since. "So, how likely is it that you'd give her this house?" At first, I thought he was joking, but the way he looked at me, the way he phrased it so casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world, it made my stomach turn. I didn't even respond. Thankfully, he laughed it off, like it was just an innocent comment. But I know my father. He's the kind of man who plants seeds, waits, and watches them grow. I haven't brought it up with Lucy yet. Maybe I'm making too much of it. Maybe it really was a joke. But something about the way he said it, the way my sister had been acting all night, makes me uneasy. I thought they wanted me back in their lives because they missed me. Now, I'm starting to wonder if there's another reason. For now, I'm letting it go. But if he brings it up again, I won't be so polite next time. I tried to let it go. Really, I did. But something about that conversation with my dad wouldn't stop gnawing at me. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Or maybe I was right all along. In the weeks after that reunion, my family started integrating themselves into my life in ways I didn't expect. Sophie, my sister, suddenly became very close with Lucy. She was always inviting her out to lunch, to go shopping, to hang out. At first, I didn't think much of it. Lucy's kind, friendly, and honestly, she'd been excited that I was reconnecting with my family. She thought it was sweet that Sophie wanted to spend time with her. But I started noticing patterns. Whenever they went shopping, Lucy came home with new things Sophie had helped her pick out. Not just little things either, but expensive purchases. My wife isn't reckless with money, but she trusts easily, and she's generous. too generous. I warned her about it. Babe, I don't mind you spending money, but just be careful with Sophie. She has a way of making people feel obligated to do things for her. Lucy shrugged it off. She's just excited to bond with me. And honestly, I like having a sister-in-law around. That was fair. I didn't want to seem like the bitter, estranged brother who saw a problem in everything. But then there was my dad. He called constantly. Before this, he hadn't cared about my life for over a decade. Now, he was suddenly interested in my job, my earnings, my investments. The conversations always started off normal. How's work? How's Lucy? Excited for the new baby, but they always took a turn. So, with what you make now, you could probably buy a second house, right? You ever think about upgrading? Maybe finding a new place? Would you ever consider renting out your current house? Or, I don't know, maybe gifting it to someone? Every time I dodged the question, but my patience was wearing thin. Meanwhile, my mom had barely spoken to me since our reunion. She didn't seem thrilled that I was back in their lives. And honestly, I didn't care. If she wanted to keep her distance, fine by me. The only time she did talk to me was about Sophie's wedding, constantly asking if we could help out financially, if Lucy could assist with the planning, and get this, if we could host the rehearsal dinner. At first, I wanted to say no. I didn't like how they were inching their way into my life with all these little favors that felt more like tests. But Lucy, ever the peacemaker, convinced me otherwise. It's just one dinner, she said. It would be rude to say no, I sighed. Fine, but I have a bad feeling about this. She laughed, kissed my cheek, and told me to stop overthinking. Turns out I wasn't overthinking anything. The night started off fine, awkward, but fine. Sophie's fiancé seemed like a nice enough guy, quiet, but polite. My parents were on their best behavior, acting like the perfect family. Everything was so normal that I started thinking, maybe I really was just being dramatic. Maybe they really do just want to reconnect. Then, halfway through dinner, Sophie's future mother-in-law complimented the house. This place is stunning. I can see why Sophie loves it so much. I caught the look Sophie exchanged with my dad, just a quick glance, but it was enough. A few minutes later, my wife and Sophie's future mother-in-law went to grab dessert from the kitchen. That's when my father struck. He leaned in, voice low but casual. So, tell me, why do you and Lucy need such a big house? I frowned. I don't know. We like the space. Why? Well, Sophie's always dreamed of having a big family, he said smoothly. A home like this would be perfect for her. I sighed, already exhausted. Dad, look, he interrupted. You're successful. You make good money. You could buy another place easily. It wouldn't even put a dent in your finances. I set my fork down. Are you seriously asking me to give Sophie my house? Again? I'm not asking, he said, as if that made it better. I'm suggesting, think of it as a wedding gift. A brotherly gesture. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but there wasn't one. You're serious? I said flatly. He nodded, and that's when it clicked. Sophie's little shopping trips with Lucy, my dad's sudden interest in my finances, my mom's indifference, like she already knew how this would play out. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment request. This was planned. I sat back in my chair, suddenly calm. How long have you been planning this? I asked. My father frowned. What? This, I said, gesturing around the room. This whole reunion. You reaching out. Sophie getting close to Lucy. Mom pretending I don't exist unless it benefits her. How long has this been your plan? He scoffed, shaking his head. Don't be ridiculous. We just thought, no. I cut him off. You plotted this. You didn't reach out because you missed me. You reached out because you wanted something from me. And now, you're cornering me in my own home, in front of everyone, hoping I'll feel too pressured to say no. His expression darkened. It's not like that. I smiled. Oh, but it is. Silence. Then, before I even realized I was going to say it, the words left my mouth. I don't understand why you're so desperate to do all this for her when she's not even yours. The whole room froze. My father blinked. His face went pale, then red. What the hell did you just say? I leaned in, smiling wider. I said, I don't understand why you're so obsessed with Sophie when she isn't even your daughter. His chair scraped against the floor as he shot up, fists clenched. That's a lie. But the look on my mother's face, that was all the confirmation I needed. She was furious. And just like that, all the pieces snapped together. The way she had turned on me so fast at 17. The accusations. The sudden eagerness to get rid of me. She had been protecting her secret. My father looked between us, realization creeping into his expression. Is this true? She shot up from her seat, her voice sharp and panicked. Get out. All of you, get out. She was scrambling to contain the explosion, but it was too late. The damage was done. Before my father walked out, I looked him dead in the eye. Get a DNA test, I said. Eventually, the truth will come out. Then I turned away, leaving them standing in the ruins of their own lies. I didn't hear from them for days after the rehearsal dinner. No calls, no messages, nothing. Honestly, I was fine with that. Lucy, though she was still in shock, I hadn't told her about my suspicions before, mostly because I wasn't sure if I was just overthinking everything. But now, after what happened, she knew everything, and she had questions. You knew? She asked that night, after we put our son to bed. I sighed. I didn't know for sure, but I suspected. My mom always treated Sophie differently. She protected her, spoiled her, and never let anything touch her. Meanwhile, the moment I got too close to figuring something out, she turned on me, framed me for something I didn't do, and had me kicked out. I didn't put it all together back then, but looking back now, it makes sense. Lucy sat quietly, taking it all in, and now? I shrugged. Now, I wait, because one thing I do know, my father isn't the type to let something like this go. And I was right. A week later, my father showed up at my office. I wasn't expecting him, but the second I saw his face, I knew what was coming. He walked in, shut the door behind him, and pulled out a white envelope. Without a word, he opened it right in front of me. I didn't need to see the results to know what they said, but still, I watched as his whole world shattered in real time. She's not mine, he whispered. His voice wasn't angry, it was broken. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? After a long pause, he looked up at me. How did you know? I leaned back in my chair. I met Sophie's real father once, years ago. Back when I was homeless, his brows furrowed, like he couldn't process what I was saying. What? I sighed. It was a chance encounter. I was just trying to find a warm place to sit when a man started asking me about my mom. Said he used to know her. At first, I thought maybe he was talking about me. Maybe I wasn't yours either. But no, he was talking about Sophie. He said my mom paid him off to disappear. My father's hands clenched around the paper. And you never told me? I let out a humorless laugh. Told you when, Dad? After you kicked me out? After you decided I wasn't worth keeping? After you spent years treating me like I was nothing? He swallowed hard, saying nothing. For the first time, he was the one feeling discarded, unwanted. I wasn't about to comfort him. You know, I said, you could have had a real son this whole time, but instead, you put everything into Sophie, someone who was never even yours to begin with. And now, you have nothing. He flinched. I still have you. I shook my head. No, you don't. Silence stretched between us before he finally stood up. He looked like a man who had just lost everything, and in a way, he had. I didn't watch him leave. I just let him go. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Later that night, I got a phone call from Sophie. She was sobbing. At first, I thought she was calling to yell at me, to blame me for ruining her perfect life. But instead, she asked for something unexpected. My real father, she whispered. Do you remember his name? I hesitated. Then, for reasons I don't fully understand, I gave it to her. A few days later, I heard she tried reaching out to him only to find out he had passed away a few years ago. That news broke her. She called off her wedding, fell into a deep depression, and, in what I assume was some kind of karmic justice, she ended up cutting my mother off completely. Speaking of my mother, she didn't go down quietly. The moment my father confronted her about the DNA results, she lost it. At first, she denied everything. Then, when that didn't work, she tried to gaslight him. And when that didn't work, she turned vicious. She told him it was his fault that if he had been a better husband, she wouldn't have needed another man. Apparently, that was the final straw for him, because that night, he snapped. My father, who, to my knowledge, had never been physically violent before, attacked her. Badly. So badly that Sophie had to call the police. My mother was hospitalized with multiple fractured vertebrae. She'll recover, but not fully. My father was arrested, charged with domestic violence, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Sophie, despite everything, refused to forgive my mother. She had always been the golden child, the favorite, but now, all she saw was a liar who had built her entire life on deception. She cut ties completely. And my mother? With my father in prison and Sophie refusing to speak to her, she was left with nothing. No money, no family, no support. She tried reaching out to me once, sent me a long, bitter text blaming me for everything. I didn't reply. I blocked her number and moved on. The final goodbye. A few years passed. I thought I was finally free. Then, One day, I got a call from an unknown number. It was my father. He had just finished his prison sentence and wanted to talk. At first, I wasn't sure if I should even pick up, but eventually, curiosity got the better of me. Surprisingly, he wasn't angry. If anything, he sounded different, quieter, more reflective. He told me that prison had forced him to do some deep thinking, that at first, he had blamed me for everything, but over time, he realized the truth. I was a bad father, he admitted. I didn't see you, and when I finally did, it was too late. I didn't say anything. Then he hit me with something I wasn't expecting. I want to do a DNA test, he said. For you, I froze. Because for years, I had secretly wondered the same thing. Was I even his? So we did the test, and the results? I wasn't his son. Neither of us spoke after reading the results. After a long pause, he cleared his throat. We can still be family, he said, if you want. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing for this man. No, I said simply. Then I walked away. That was the last time I ever saw him. I had always thought that finding out the truth would change something in me, that maybe, if I wasn't his, I would feel lost. But I don't, because I already have everything I need. Lucy, my son, my newborn daughter, my real family. I don't know who my biological father is, and honestly, I don't care. What matters is the life I have now, and I'll be damned if I let the mistakes of the past define it.